When Ashish got in touch with me a few weeks back, talking about a potential discussion that we could have here with the audience and try and replicate the Headout story, however short that story is so far. We've been in the business only for about a year and a half. I thought it was exciting and terrifying at the same time, and I'll tell you why. Right, so the story kind of begins about 3 years back. This was UnPluggd 2013, if I'm not wrong. And I was coming here for the very first time, maybe like some of you. I was as disconnected from the tech startup ecosystem as it possibly can be, as I possibly can be. I didn't come from a premier engineering institute. In fact, I didn't do engineering at all in the first place. I didn't do an IIM or an MBA from somewhere. I was actually a graduate of bachelor's in business administration from Bangalore University, right? And so this was a completely new world for me. And I felt intimidated and excited at the same time. And so I was here, sitting in the audience, looking at people talking about various products that they've built and what's worked and what's not. And then fast forward a year from that, UnPluggd 2014, which is when things started getting interesting. So in that time frame of about a year, for the first, I would say 9 months, things were quiet. I was just doing my own thing back then, and things were the same as they always were. But then two folks, my good friends, Suren and Vikram, decided to come together with me and then start something called Headout, right? So this is kind of like really early 2014. We had just about launched our desktop site. It was a different version of what we were doing, same market, same rough, broad vertical, but a very different implementation of it. And so we had come to UnPluggd, we were pitching here, like a lot of you guys would be, to anybody that was willing to listen, right? I mean, we humans are extremely greedy and needy species as always, and so you try and get that vote of confidence and vote of approval from anybody that's willing to listen to you. And so we try to talk to VCs, we try to talk to founders and everybody and pitch what Headout was doing and try to get a sense of what they liked and what they didn't. I still remember there was lunch being served. I think this was happening in JP Nagar back then. And so there was lunch being served, and there was Alok from Ixigo, and there were a couple of other guys. I think it was Naveen there, if I'm not wrong. And I used to kind of keep going back in the queue to try and get behind them so that I can get a chance to speak with them, right? And so most of those conversations went in the direction where we used to pitch saying we did this, this is our traction so far, and we've been live for about 1.5, 2 months. What do you guys think? And they were like, interesting, get in touch with us, send us an email, or we'll get in touch later and we'll figure it out from there. And so it's not bad enough that somebody says you suck, but they also don't say that this is wonderful. And so you're kind of stuck in this middle quagmire, right, where you don't know whether what you're doing is the right thing or the wrong thing. And so this continued as a theme for the rest of the day. And I guess this is just people being nice, but I guess being nice has never really helped anyone. So come to the end of the day, it's been a really long day, I have exhausted myself, and I meet this gentleman from a marquee fund that's based in the US and in India. Ironically, they are now investors in Headout, but that's a different story. I met him and I pitched what we were doing, and he, to my absolute surprise, comes back to me and says, listen, Varun, it seems like what you're saying doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, you seem like a smart guy, but I think you're completely on a different tangent here. And from our side, it's a very emphatic no. And that was the first time that somebody on a casual conversation of about 30 to 60 seconds had actually looked at what we do and said, this is not something that we're interested in, right? And it was a bit surprising, to say the least. And so I kind of got done with the conference, went out, opened up Redbus, booked a bus ticket, the cheapest one I could find, to Hyderabad, because Suren was, my co-founder Suren was at that time in Hyderabad with his parents. And so I got down to Hyderabad, and this was like a really trying time for the company, right? We had been doing this for about 3 months, extremely limited savings, working out of my home in JP Nagar, and I used to live with my girlfriend. I mean, I still do actually, thankfully. And so we were working out of my home, Suren was living with me, and Vikram was practically there all the time. And it was an absolute mess. We were not making a lot of progress. VCs were not saying yes. We're not getting a lot of traction on demand or on supply side and so on and so forth. And so this was like just like a sort of a seminal moment, right? You're like, is this even making sense? And so we got down to Hyderabad. We thought it might make sense to just kind of get a change of environment from the same old 2 BHK that we were spending 24/7 all the time in JP Nagar. So we get there, and we are getting drunk with a bunch of friends on a Saturday evening in Hyderabad, and we kind of talk about the idea that, listen, when we initially thought of Headout, we had always kind of imagined this as a service that's extremely spontaneous and on demand, right? And we had thought of the service as something that would essentially work only if there is a certain amount of buy-in from a supply standpoint, and there's a certain amount of density in terms of people wanting to do these things and people willing to provide these things. And so that market seems to be North America and Europe at this point in time and not India. So why don't we just move there instead of trying to make this work in India? And in our state back then, we said, of course that makes sense, and we said, of course we should do it. So we ended the night on a really high note, no pun intended there, and so we said, okay, we're going to figure out a way to get to the US and go from there. Except the next day when we woke up with a hangover and we were talking about what we discussed last night, it suddenly didn't make any sense. There was no parallel that we could drive about a bunch of Indian founders moving to the US, building a consumer internet brand there from scratch and making it all work, right? And so we started getting in touch with people that we had kind of connected in the ecosystem and said, hey, this is what we think, what do you guys think? And so everybody categorically replied, the range was like, are you stupid, to like, I don't think this will work, right? So it was somewhere between that range. The only exception was Naveen from InMobi. Happened to meet him through a common friend, and I'm not even sure if Naveen would sort of remember this really short meeting. And so I said that this is what we have in mind, what do you think? And he was like, what do you think? And I was like, no, I think it makes sense, I think we should do it. And he was like, okay, so I mean, if you think you should do it, like, what's the problem? And I was like, no, but logically people are saying that there are certain pitfalls, and I can see why. And so what's your sense? Should we do it or should we not do it? So he gave me two answers back then, right? So he's like, first, when somebody says no, it's actually a great thing. It gives you extreme amount of clarity of thought in terms of whether they understand what you're doing and whether what you're doing is working or not. And second, don't buy too much of what people have to say. The initial idea itself of leaving a cushy job and starting a company is by default in a way an illogical thing to do, right? And so if that's so illogical, if the basic premise itself is so stupid in a way, then why would you try and then find logic in all the other decisions that you make from there on? And so 4 days from that conversation, the three of us packed our bags. For context, none of us had actually lived in the US or worked there before. We just booked our flight tickets, one-way flight tickets, the cheapest one that we could find. I still remember we booked a Saudi flight with a 14-hour layover in Jeddah and a 6-hour layover in Riyadh. And so we then got to, and of course it's Saudi, so you don't get booze on the flight, which doesn't really help. And so we got all the way till the US and started working on Headout there. And so the story has been kind of very different, right? So the first half of the story was about hearing that really emphatic no, taking that in, and then taking a call as to what makes sense from there on, right? So not to shy away from the idea of getting a no is the one big learning that we got there. The second half of the story is when we got to the US, we landed in New York because that's where we thought we should launch the product. And we got speaking to a bunch of angels, very surprisingly, on zero traction, zero product, just on a really nice looking deck. We got a $25,000 check, and that was enough for us to be able to kind of sustain for 2 months in New York, build the product, speak to users, get supply, get demand, get the wheels moving, and get the company started, right? So we started working on this in June 2014. We launched the product on September 1st, 2014, and end of September, we moved to Silicon Valley to be a part of 500 startups, and there we have this big question, right? So we had just launched the product, it had been about 2 weeks, and the question that we had in front of us was, do we build this for everybody, or do we build this for a really small subset of users that are looking to do something spontaneously right now? And our thought, of course, was like, there was again no parallel except for Hotel Tonight, which was driving a price wedge by being last minute. There was no other company in the space that was asking people to just book for the next few hours, right? If you look at Ticketmaster or Eventbrite or whichever company you want to talk about in the US, you essentially could book an event or an activity or an experience for today or for a year out. It doesn't really matter. And so we were like, if that's the case, why would we not replicate that? But the problem that we felt was all the use cases that we were excited by and the place where we thought we could derive the maximum amount of value was in the use case where somebody was looking to do something spontaneously. And so at that point in time, we had this sort of first epiphany moment of saying no, right? So we sat down and we categorically said no to a number of different things. We said no to the idea of being full service. We said no to the idea of launching more than one city. We said no to the idea of raising more capital at that point in time because we didn't know whether what we had built made sense or didn't make sense. Sorry, let me try and get that back. Anyways, yeah, so we started saying no to a lot of things, and that kind of brought us to this fact that no is a really powerful tool that you have at your disposal if you consume or use it in the right possible framework in the right context, right? And so we said no to a number of things, like we didn't have user login at start, we didn't have search, we didn't have filters, we had a very limited set of products and experience that you could buy. But we thought that if somebody is looking at doing something spontaneously, they don't want too much choice. They want something that can just tell them what they can be doing in a really short span of time and can get them to check out as quickly as possible, and they can just do that in real life, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we are in the business of evolving the way people discover their cities or new cities in a manner where they can connect in real life with experiences and people outside and do all of that as quickly and as spontaneously as possible at the push of a button. So if that's the fundamental mission, then we should not be over bloating the product with a number of features. And so those two things have been those are two sort of very similar axioms, saying no and listening to no. And we have kept that at the core of everything that we do at Headout, right? So whether that's a new feature request, whether that's a new city that we want to launch, whether that's hiring somebody, the default state is no, we should not do it unless there's a very compelling reason to do it. And so doing a lot lesser in that sense has actually helped us do a lot more. And this is something that I think even was echoed by Sujat, who's a good friend, who runs Vunik. Earlier this morning, he was talking about how they focused on doing just one single thing at a time. And that's really powerful because, I mean, coming from the Paul Graham sort of school of thought, it's impossible to appeal to everybody at the same time while you're trying to wage a long, bloody battle and trying to win a market, right? So you have to, I mean, it's a war. It's a really long and exhausting war, and you can't be opening all the battlefronts at the same time. And so you kind of edit, right? You fix the battle at a certain strategic point, and you say that this is where I'm going to put all my focus on. And because my focus is on this, my solution will be 100x better than what anybody else is building there. And so we did that focus on the last minute spontaneous use case, and that's worked out for us phenomenally. As was said at the very beginning of this talk, we were at roughly, let's say that number was X in March. We're currently at about 26X of that in the last 14 months to be precise. And the reason for that growth is that we have very categorically been very, very averse to doing a lot of new things that are just bloating the product and not really helping users in a really tangible fashion, right? And if you're still not convinced, there's no easier way to convince than this cartoon that Eric had shared. This is about a couple of years back, right? So if you look at Apple as a product and if you look at Google as a product, two biggest tech giants together creating value of north of $500 billion, right? And of course, they are extremely complicated products, but at the user interface level of it, it's one simple button or one simple search bar. And more often than not, you end up in a situation where you say that, no, it's not possible for my product to be that simple, but that's unfortunately taking the easier route out. The harder thing for you to be doing here at this stage is to be able to find a way to bring the complexity down to a level where all the complex processing is happening at the back end, which is not visible to the user, but what's happening at the front end is a very simple visual way of consuming information that's precise and that's very, very narrow, right? We are living in the day and age of information overload. We typically get about 360 emails a day. We check our phones about 6-7 times in an hour. We literally don't have time to consume information. And so the harder you make it for people to consume a simple set of information, the more difficult it is for you to be able to kind of drive value. And this is a phenomenon that's especially true in a lot of Indian startups where they verticalize. They start with one vertical and then they go horizontal very, very quickly, where you would have the same app doing 100 different things, right? Which just does not drive enough value, especially when you're really young as a company, and your user base is still not very, very precise, and the product market fit it's like wet clay. It's being formed, right? It's in the process of kind of solidifying, but it's not there yet. And so the philosophy, which was actually coined by a minimalist architect in Denmark, which said less is more, right? If you do less, you actually probably end up doing more. And this is an age-old philosophy which has now been brought in the world of products over the last about a decade or so. And Apple was like the first exponent of this theory in a realistic fashion. But today, I mean, if you look at the most great products, and if you look at the first sort of 0 to 3 years of their journey, they were extremely simplistic products in the way that they did solve a certain problem in a very specific manner. And so the axiom that less is always more, no matter how much you would like to believe is not true, is true. And even though it sounds counterintuitive, I think founders would do themselves a lot of justice by focusing on this and trying to find a way to uncomplicate. And this is not just true in the digital world, right? Even if you look at real life examples, I mean, if you look at your TV remote, more often than not, you essentially end up only using about 4 buttons almost all the time, right? But you still have a good set of 30, 35 buttons there which are absolutely useless. But you have them and they're just adding to cognitive load, right? The same thing happens with a dashboard of a car. I mean, it seems very complicated if I'm a new user or I'm a new driver. I'm actually kind of quite intimidated by that, right? It should not be that hard to drive a car and it should not look like a spaceship. And the same holds true for appliances today, whether it's the refrigerator or the grinder or whatever it might be, as and when people are adding more and more features, creating a refrigerator with TV, which actually does not make any sense, but they're doing it because they are saying, why not? The question should not be why not, the question should be why, right? And so there's a fundamental difference in what kind of question you ask when you're looking at a new feature. Coming to feature fatigue, right? So this is a term that was coined by University of Waterloo, I think about 2006, so about 7, 8 years back. And the term happened as a result of a really interesting study. So the study was that they bifurcated a group of people into 2 halves, and the first half was given a bunch of products which had a lot of features, along with the ability to be able to customize those features in every different way possible. And that half chose more products than the one that didn't have products that had a lot of features. However, when they started using that product, the first half, which had a higher percentage of products that they had chosen, were a lot more unhappy with their products. And the reason for this was because of the learning curve involved in dealing with multiple features and the learning curve involved in having distributed sort of focus across multiple features while doing one single activity, right? And so their happiness with the product went down dramatically, and their ability to be able to say that I will recommend this product or I'll be able to come back and buy this product again went down significantly. And so on a net basis, the second half, which actually bought lesser products upfront, but actually had a much bigger viral impact and a much bigger retention impact, was a better thing to do from a financial standpoint for a company. And so this is true for any digital interface world. Again, the same sort of parallel can be driven there, where if you do one thing and if you do one thing really well, you might be able to get lesser people through the door upfront, but those people will stick and they'll create a lot more value for you in the long term, which is a lot more stickier than having a set of features that can be replicated easily and that are just spread across without having a unified vision, so to speak. Which is what brings us to the idea of saying no, right? So we started this with the story of how saying no is really powerful, and my intention was to kind of say, to paint the canvas that no can be said in a number of different contexts. It's not just from a product standpoint, but this talk is predominantly about what saying no means for a product, right? From a feature standpoint. But the same logic can be applied to launching a new city, adding more members, doing something versus not doing something in your product, and so on and so forth. And that's actually not just saying no. Like a lot of times when we come up with a feature request, the idea is that we say, we'll do it later, maybe not right now. And there's a difference between saying maybe and there's a difference between saying no. And I think the definitiveness of a no is extremely important, because it will essentially allow the person who is looking for this as a possible future addition to just categorically stop thinking about this and start thinking about the problem, right? We face this age-old issue where we keep talking about features. I want to add X, I want to add Y, I want to add Z, and I think we stop talking about the solution or the problem behind why we are trying to add that. So that tends to happen when you're talking in terms of features. And if you start saying no to a lot of these things, people will start going back to the drawing board more often and start looking at problems in a more holistic fashion. This also is true for the company of our generation in a certain sense, right? If you talk about Uber, there is a very fundamental reason why Uber does not allow you to book cabs in advance. And this is something that companies like Ola in India and elsewhere in the world have copied a little later, but Uber from day one was not allowing people to book cabs in advance. And one of the factors was liquidity. They wanted to ensure that they had the right amount of liquidity at the moment when somebody is looking for a car versus somebody who is available to give a car. But there's a second reason behind it, right? And this was something that wasn't obvious to me, but we had the fortune of having one of Uber's earliest employees be an investor in Headout. And their fundamental thesis behind not having that as an option was to uncomplicate the product checkout flow. They wanted somebody to be able to call a car in the shortest possible clicks or taps in this case, right? And that wasn't possible if you allowed people to pre-book this, because then you would have to select a slot, select a time, and so on and so forth. And it was increasing the number of taps required by about 40%, which they didn't want at all. And so for the sake of simplicity, they decided to not build something that potentially people said was a huge capital sunk, right? Like you have so much capacity that you're building, but you're not giving the capacity enough time to be able to utilize that capacity. You're just utilizing capacity for now, you aren't utilizing it for the future, which leads to lower yields. But they missed the fact that a lot more friction when it comes to user experience is worse off than worrying about the utilization of the capacity that Uber actually holds by X number of cars that they have on the road right now. And which brings me to the second point, which is about constraints, right? So normally when people talk about constraints, they frown. It seems like something that's so irritating. Like if I had this, I would be able to do X. If I had Y, I would do Z, and so on and so forth. And this happens typically at every stage of the company. And trust me, it doesn't get any easier, right? Like if you are at a stage where you've raised zero money, you're like, if I had 50 lakhs with me, I could change this world. And if you raise 50 lakhs and then you're like, okay, if I had 5 crores, then I could like really scale this up. And then that 5 becomes 50 and 50 becomes 500 and 500 becomes 5,000. And it's a never ending cycle, right? It's not a pyramid, it's kind of a cycle. And so in that sense, what I realized was that having an artificial constraint is a really powerful thing. In our case, we superimposed a constraint on Headout in terms of the window in which people can book it and in terms of where we are allowing this product to be available. So we are only on mobile, which means that you cannot use it if you want to use it on desktop. And I know there is a wonderful debate going on here with Myntra going there, coming back, so on and so forth, and people kind of, sitting on both sides of the fences. Most people actually didn't have an opinion, except whichever way the trend went, they said, oh, of course I said that, and so on and so forth. But if you look at it, fundamentally, buying a clothes is a very different phenomenon than being on the go and looking for something to do, right? And so we believe that that was always the use case, and people will always be either on their tablet or on their phone. And so we always put that constraint from day one, and that's worked beautifully, not just from a user experience standpoint, but from a technical and a management debt standpoint. Like the company didn't have to invest time, money, and effort into building multiple platforms, which is super awesome because we can then focus on building what we know really works well, right? Which brings me to mobile. I mean, mobile probably has been the biggest evolution in terms of creating a new form factor and a new level of constraint. However, in a certain sense, what we have done is we have just crammed down what we used to do on a wider screen today onto a smaller screen, where most companies have the same set of features that they have on desktop that they have on mobile. It's like the exact same, just put in a separate drawer, right? And that needs to be questioned at a fundamental level, because a lot of times when you are in a mobile context, and when I say mobile context, I'm talking about you're on the go, you are mobile in a true sense of the word. Do you really need all of those things, right? And there's a big question mark, and that's not been answered yet, but you see a lot of mobile-only companies emerge over the last few years that are kind of questioning that paradigm from its very fundamentals, and we are seeing, I think we're at sort of the tip of the iceberg when it comes to really being able to explore native mobile capabilities and really being able to really make sense of that and get the maximum crux, maximum juice that we can from that. Which brings me to the idea of confusing features with the idea of a need, right? Typically when we talk about features, we're like, no, of course we need that because of X and Y and Z. And the problem is that a feature is not a need, right? The best example I could think of, and I don't know if a lot of you would have used this service before. When I was a kid, I used to spend a lot of time on this chat service called ICQ. It used to be actually even more popular than AOL chat, right? And ICQ was a phenomenal service back then, had the world on its toes, and people were like gaga about it. But the time between 94 to 99, ICQ almost became obsolete. And the only reason why AOL Chat and Yahoo Messenger survived that era and ICQ didn't is because if you remember, I mean, I don't have GUI chart pics right now of that service, but if you guys Google it, you'd realize that it was so fundamentally bloated as a product that it was almost impossible to use it and feel good about it, right? You almost felt like you were getting into this mine and there were 100 different like dark loopholes in front of you and you're going to go different paths and you don't know where you end up. And so that led to a lot of user backlash, and ICQ's dev team and product team never really kind of understood that and kept building more and more features. Their idea of solving growth was adding more features, not cutting features, not editing features, and that basically ran them to the ground. The other example of this is Facebook Home. It surprisingly has completely erased itself from public memory, but if you think about it, they came onto the scene with a lot of fanfare, and the product bombed as soon as it came out, right? And so the fundamental sort of disconnect there was that they misconstrued the idea of people using different features on the Facebook app versus the fact that they need this service day in and day out. And so we will replace the underlying OS of the phone itself and change that with a Facebook OS. And well, nobody really wanted that, right? So that was a feature within the wide universe of Facebook, but it wasn't a feature that people wanted on their phone, and it wasn't really a need or a problem that people had to face, and so it just never really took off. And I mean, it was a huge failure. It's just that Facebook PR did a pretty good job of making sure that it's all covered. But this is at the same level of Google Plus and Buzz from Google, which was also, I think, a 2007 release or something. And so let's kind of move on and talk about what are the things that we need to be really, really careful about when we're looking at adding features to product or just having product discussions with founders or your teams, right? So the first thing is complexity cost, and this can be quantified in a number of different ways. I mean, the simplest way to do this is the cost of having more engineers and having more product people and having more design people to build what you want to build. We have been talking to some of the folks in the Valley and in India in terms of getting them on board as product designers over the last couple of weeks. And I hear teams talking about having 9 UI designers and 5 UX designers and 3 graphic designers in their design team, right? So a team of 15 to 18 people for an Android, for a product that basically just has one Android app and one iOS app and a regular website. And that fundamentally doesn't make sense. But that's essentially what ends up happening if you have just too many features that you want to build. You add complexity to the entire process. So this is complexity on the internal side. Then there is complexity on the user side, right? Users have to try and sift through all of these different features to understand what is the core proposition that they really value, which gets more and more difficult as you keep piling on more and more features over them. The second thing happens due to anecdotal bullshit, right? So people say that we need to build this because I know that somebody said that we need to do this, right? And that has never really made sense. You need to be able to look at data and to be able to quantify this. But if you don't, and if you just build things for the sake of building them because somebody else said so, then you're going down a path where I think coming back from that is just extremely hard and expensive, both in terms of time and effort and money. The third reason is jealousy, right? So my competitor has this feature, and so I want it. And what fundamental thing that most startups kind of, I think, forget is that you're most likely not competing with another service. You're competing with the idea of somebody who is your prospective customer not solving this problem at all, or just maintaining status quo or not giving a shit, right? And so it doesn't really matter if somebody has 10,000 features more than you. What matters is, are you solving a solution? And solving solutions is not equal to having more features. So that entire chain is not very clear, and when the clarity evades itself and there is lack of brevity, then you end up in a situation where you're just replicating and playing catch up with other people's features, which is a war that you most likely will not win. The other is just gambling, right? Just pure like kind of making random bets. I was sitting in the morning, I felt like this could change the world, and so I'm going to like go out there and build this feature. And there's a lot of things being said about founders and their instincts, and the need to be able to back their instincts in times when data is not clear. But there's a difference between instinct and and gambling. And in most cases, when it comes to features, a lot of times people just add things again because they think that it will solve a next problem. Whereas sometimes the way to solve a problem is by removing something, not necessarily by adding it, right? The last one is probably actually the most common one, time pass. We have a number of people sitting in the company. We have 15 designers. We have 40 product managers that we've hired out of ISB in one single batch. And so we need to give them work. And so what do, right? So they will come here, sit down, work on creating X different features, and we'll push them out and we'll see how it works. And that's lazy at best, and that doesn't really kind of translate into true value for the user or for the company. So those are the things that I would say that we should always kind of look out for as pitfalls when we start talking about features. You know, it's like a checklist. Like if we talk about X feature, hey, are we talking about any one of these paradigms? And if we are, then we should be cautious about that. The culmination of this is, I think, the fundamental disconnect between the idea of what a founder and a product team should be doing, right? A lot of times building is supposed to be the only thing, right? It's creating. Like when you say I'm building products, you're talking about creating something from nothing. But at times, it can actually be about editing as much as it is about creation, right? It's equally effective to be able to edit and make things more concise and more precise than it is to just add things to it. And it can be a really powerful tool to be able to drive engagement, retention, or just value proposition in whatever format that you think is correct. If you look at features, right, one of the counterintuitive things about features is that the ones that are the most complex, in most cases, actually derive the least amount of value, right? So they take a lot of time in terms of thinking, in terms of speccing it out, in terms of actually making it from an engineering standpoint. But when you make them and you release them, they actually have almost zero impact and move the needle to an extent where it doesn't really matter. It's the really small features that are essentially creating aha moments in your product, which tip the needle for you. And these are features that are very hard to quantify, but when done really well, they can change the face of what your company is perceived at, right? I'm talking about Instagram filter. I'm talking about the loader that used to happen when Uber first came out. Being ability to be able to see cars moving around you and having this sort of jigsaw puzzle of game where it used to be almost like fun, right? To be able to see what's moving around and then clicking on it and then being able to call it where you are right now and so on and so forth. So all of these different features are really small things, but they are fundamentally different way of looking at the problem versus looking at my customers are not able to search, my customers are not able to, use sort, my customers are not able to, I don't know, go and be able to like have infinite scroll and so on and so forth. Those are very different paradigms to solve problems for. What are the different variables when it comes to how we should decide as to whether we should add this feature or whether we should look at building this into our product, right? One is the stage of the company. Where are you in your evolution? Today, if a Facebook adds a feature that is not driving enough value, people are willing to put up with that crap. But if you're a service that nobody knows about and you have a few hundred, few thousand users and you add unnecessary shit that nobody's going to use, then that's not going to fly with them and they're just going to stop using you, right? And so at what stage are you is directly proportional to the number of features that you can add. And so the smaller you are and the younger you are, the lesser features that you should be adding, not just because you have lesser engineering bandwidth, but just because it doesn't make sense that your user base will not be able to put up with that shit, right? The second stage is finance, and this is a broad term, but this is in terms of cost across engineering and also in terms of kind of potential revenue for the company. And I'll give you an example here. eBay in 2006 dropped this feature where earlier people who used to upload products on eBay had to pay a certain fee for being able to upload an image on eBay, right? And images were important because they help conversion, but there was a certain cost involved in having servers who could actually manage the load of having all of those images on board. And so eBay used to charge all the people who were listing a nominal fee for doing that. In 2006, they decided to drop that altogether. And the reason for doing so, in spite of the cost involved in the infrastructure cost involved in managing that, was that the conversion that eBay was getting when pictures were there was a lot more than the revenue that they were making from the fee that the folks that were listing were giving on to eBay, right? And that was a significant revenue stream for them, by the way. It was the second biggest revenue stream that eBay had after their commissions. So eBay overnight chose to switch off a revenue stream that was the second biggest source of income for them and change that completely on the belief that having this feature is giving us negative cost, right? And so there's a better way to derive value and make more money for the company by just making it free. And so there is a cost. So the cost equation is not just about the number of people and the cost involved in managing that. It's a little more than that. It's about switching cost, and it's about cost involved in if you don't do this, then what engagement would you see and what happens as a result of that. The third is engagement, right? So ties in really well with the first point, where if your users are super engaged right now, then you can take some liberties. But if your users, if your funnel is really leaky and people are dropping off at different stages, then you can't take them for granted, and you will have to be very, very conscious about choosing to not add anything at the expense of possibly being left behind in a certain sense. Once you do that, once you do add some features, one of the easiest ways to get your team to buy into the idea that adding features is not solving problems is to be able to measure impact. We feel at times, even at Headout, that we are in this race to be able to just add things, right? We skip from one engineering project to another, to another, to another. So we start with building X and then we just keep moving on to another, and we don't take some time to reflect on the numbers as to what that impact, what the impact was for whatever we shipped out. And so if you stop measuring it, you will not realize exactly as to what's going on. But if you do, you will be able to really be able to sift through the BS and see, okay, this worked, this did not work, and drive this culture in the company that, guys, if it's not working, we need to pull it down and take this as a learning to be able to not build some of these things going forward, or at least find a way to build proxies where you're building a really small version of it and trying to assess impact. And if it works, then you double down on it, then you make the actual full-bloated feature, right? This is a solution to some of the problems that you had at Headout that we implemented, and something that probably could be used for a number of you guys sitting here in the audience today as well. Dave, of course, is an investor in Headout, and one of his primary things when we used to do office hours with him was about the fact that we're doing a bit too much, right? We tried to scorch the entire earth, and we were failing in some cases and we were succeeding in some cases, but if we could just focus on a specific set of areas, then we could increase the intensity of the heat that we are creating, right? And so he had this slide that he used to talk about, and this is, by the way, I've edited it for taking out. I mean, Dave would not say this, right? This thing would be like, kill a fucking feature every single fucking week. That's Dave. But if you remove that for a second, and if you just look at what he was trying to say, if you start removing some of these features, and if you see that none of your users actually came back to you and created a hue and cry about this, then a feature never really mattered any which ways, right? And so it's completely fine to drop it. So we did this exercise between November 2014, 15 and third week of November and end of December, right? So about 6 weeks, every week we used to maniacally look at something and say, okay, this is not making sense, we're just going to drop it, we'll see what happens. And we saw our conversions go up roughly by about 47% in that same time frame of 6 weeks. And all we did was nothing but just reduce stuff, right? We started showing lesser products. We started showing lesser collections. We started showing lesser information on the product card. We started showing lesser information on the product pages and the checkout flow. And that actually helped people make decisions faster and move through the funnel faster. So it worked well, and this is something that 500 has done with a number of their portfolio companies across different times, and I would highly recommend that you just do this as an exercise, play with it, experiment with it, and if it works, then I think it can be a great value add to what you guys are doing. I would end with an example. There's a company called Knox. I'm sure most of you guys would know about this, and they have a product here, which is their most expensive product. I think it's about $1,800 or so. It's got about 32 different variations of how you could use it, right? Phenomenal product, known worldwide for the various different things that you could do with these knives and various other accessories that you get with it. But if you do know Knox, and if you do dive into their finances, what you would realize is their highest selling product and their most profitable product is a single blade tool that they have, and not the Swiss knife with the 32 different variants, right? This is outselling that by an order of magnitude, both in terms of number of units and in terms of the profitability that it drives for the company. And so it's a really precise example of how having more simpler products can actually do phenomenal things for your company and for the product that you're building. That's me, and that's my story so far. I'm open to questions. No strong thesis here in terms of this works and this doesn't, but I'm sure there are a bunch of you here have questions, so we can sit down and jam about this and try and figure out what works and what doesn't for some of the individual specific cases here.
Anyone got questions? We get a mic around.
Hi, nice talk.
Hey, thanks.
I've been following your company because I myself have a travel startup actually. Just curious, you're like last minute bookings, right? In Vegas, San Francisco, like if somebody wants to do something. How did you grow your product? How did you find your initial user base, or the first 100 or first 1,000?
Yeah, so I mean, beg, borrow, steal, right? So the first set of 100 people, I don't know, spammed every single person I knew in those cities on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Twitter, to the point where they could probably call it harassment. We seeded every single free public forum that we could find where people used to ask questions about what I should be doing in my own city or what I should be doing when I'm traveling to X city and so on and so forth. We tried and pitched this to 100 different reporters and tried to get them to write about us so that we can get some free traffic to the site. We optimized the hell out of our App Store page so that we can drive tremendous amount of value through ASO. So it's all of that. No one thing that worked and no one thing that didn't work. I know at once we were really pushing boundaries with Twitter, where we had created a bot that used to be able to pick certain tweets which had certain keywords that we were tracking, and then automatically reply to that tweet saying that, hey, check out Headout, right? And Twitter started blocking us, and so we were at one point in time running about 77 different Twitter accounts that used to just do this automatically, find tweets and tweet to them, and Twitter kept shutting it down, and we kept opening new accounts, and we kept doing this for about 3 months. And I wouldn't say that it drove a ton of value in terms of revenue for the company, but it's one of the things that is an example of how you can really push boundaries and be creative about how you can get your initial user base. And of course, most things will not work, and very, very few limited number of things will work. But if you are keeping your product simple, but innovating on the distribution side and focusing on what users are saying and going back and trying ways to even more sort of uncomplicate your product to another level, it pays off at some stage, and the flywheel starts rotating in the right direction. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. I just had a question regarding, you said you experimented with dropping features maniacally every week.
Right.
That's great. We should try to, build simpler products. But there's also a school of thought which says that always keep, your users is not one monolithic thing, right? So those early adopters, those guys who really love your product, so keep something for them which may not be for your average user, but keep something which, which only the kind of the early adopters will get. And that kind of keeps bringing them back because they feel, they have these kind of super features which are meant only for them. So I was just wondering, like sometimes as devs, we get very excited about building this cool new feature, which, often we realize later that the average user is not very excited about. But how do you kind of strike that balance, You want to delight and wow them, and sometimes it takes a while for them to discover that wow and delight. So
yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think that there are 2 points here. So one is the difference between building features for solving problems and building features to create aha moments, right? And more often than not, we are essentially building features to solve problems. And we're adding features to the stack to solve more and more problems. And we tend to forget that, hey, listen, what exactly is that moment where somebody would come to the app and look at this and like, oh, fuck, like, wow, that's pretty cool, right? That's pretty amazing. And normally that's never about some really complex thing that happens in the background. It's normally about a really small interaction, a really small tweak, a really small feedback that happens on doing something on a specific interface, right? So we need to start looking at creating delight as a fundamental way to look at problem solving and not as an afterthought once we have solved all the basic user problems. So that's one. The second point, which was the first question that you asked, where how do we keep your original users who are used to a certain set of features engaged? I think the ideal answer is that don't start with too many features, right? So don't do what we did. Start with very, very limited features and keep adding them so that you don't get to a stage where you're over bloated and you're then starting to drop, because that means that you've already kind of crossed the chasm and you're pulling it back now. So in the utopian world, I would say that, hey, let's go really slow and let's keep adding things when they start making sense so that nobody's antagonized at the end of it. But if you haven't, and let's say most companies here would be in the bracket where they're on the bloated side, I think that if you are extremely transparent about why you're doing what you're doing and just let the specific set of users in your community know about this beforehand, then they are more often than not very receptive to it. The problem that happens is when they feel blindsided, right? When they feel that something happened and they didn't know about this, and they got to know after it went live or through the press or whatever, that's when it really kind of hurts in a certain sense to early adopters because they feel like married, right? They're like almost like tied to the product by the hip. And so if you're transparent, I think transparency can drive, can solve most of these issues. Easier said than done, of course, but you have to do what you have to do, right? You have to look at the larger good. And so sometimes that might be about letting go of some features that are being used by a very, very small set of folks that isn't adding a lot of value to the company.
Varun, thank you so much. Can we have
Thank
a huge
you.
round of applause for Varun? And here's a small token of appreciation.
Thank you so much.